Can someone go through life without suffering? If they can, then what would such a life look like? Is a life without suffering achievable, or desirable even? On the concept of suffering, everyone is most certainly aware of its existence. Pain and suffering are some of the most potent feelings anyone can experience. A common remark is that suffering is intense because it demands to be felt. No matter how much a person attempts to ignore the pain, it only serves to strengthen its resolve when it returns with a vengeance. Nobody wants to talk about suffering, nor do they wish to suffer any sort of affliction. Indeed, Jeremy Bentham, one of the most famous utilitarians, discusses the idea of pain and pleasure in his Principles of Moral Legislation, published in 1781. In Chapter 1, Section 1 of the text, he states that, quote, "Nature has placed mankind under the governance of two sovereign masters, pain and pleasure," end quote. And in Chapter 4, Section 1, he states further that, quote, "Pleasures, then, and the avoidance of pains are the ends that the legislator has in view," end quote. From his perspective, all actions of man are in accordance with the maximization of pleasure and the minimalization of pain. Life is suffering. To deny the existence of suffering is similar to denying that water is wet. In other words, it is self-evident because everyone wishes to avoid suffering and pursue happiness instead. Continuing on, today's video will examine whether someone can have a life devoid of suffering and what steps will be required to preserve such a life. Furthermore, the case will be made that this life is undesirable and that an individual is better off to not avoid suffering entirely, but rather to become strong enough in order to mitigate life's inevitable suffering. To begin, can someone lead a life devoid of suffering? Yes, it is theoretically possible, but you would be hard-pressed to call it living. Suffering manifests itself in ways that include the physical, emotional, intellectual, and the spiritual spheres. All four of these realms of suffering have direct impacts on our lives and vary from person to person. What is insurmountable for one may be nothing more than a speed bump for another. Suffering is more subjective than objective, but we need not explore why that is here. A previous video has already examined the notion of pain, as well as its subjectivity if you wish to gain more insight into that topic. Nevertheless, what we are searching for at present is whether it is feasible to avoid all four of these versions of suffering. To avoid physical suffering entirely, this hypothetical person must forego any activity that poses a risk to their person. So, no driving, flying, walking, running, etc. Wow, so they are compelled to do absolutely nothing then. You can already see how boring this life would be, not to mention how pitiful. To avoid any sort of physical pain, their best option would be to remain in their room all day and never leave. Yet, there is no guarantee that any physical pain would not befall them. They could stub their toe on their bed, or smack their head on the wall. The point in saying all this is to assert how impossible it would be to live a life without any pretense of suffering or discomfort. A person in this situation would require all of their food to be delivered to them, and their every need accounted for. However, this is not possible as the demands of everyday life require them to work or seek the financial means to support themselves, which obviously entails physical risk. Switching now to emotional pain. If this person desires to prevent this type of pain, they could sidestep any emotionally charged situation. But this also seems next to impossible, as some emotional suffering is to arise when dealing with other people. One could reply and say, well, just avoid all people and go live completely on your own. In other words, live a solitary life with little human contacts. That may reduce emotional distress because there is a lower probability of getting into emotional entanglements, but it does not undoubtedly eliminate the risk. For some people, being alone causes emotional distress, i.e., loneliness. This is most certainly veritable nowadays, where loneliness has been identified as a serious health problem. A person may attempt to shield themselves from emotional distress by foregoing entanglements with others. Avoiding rejection is the most common purpose for this, but this is not always a robust method of operation. As it has already been asserted, it could possibly arouse more emotional suffering in a person who undertakes this action. On to the intellectual aspect now. If one wishes to avoid intellectual suffering, they could simply endeavor to never think of any topic of great difficulty. So, do not be a philosopher then, right? Jokes aside, this also fails to hold up because a person can become intellectually distressed, even when the plainest answers elude their understanding. We do not know what to do at every moment in time. We do not have all the answers, hence why we are in constant debate. One does not have to be overly intelligent to experience intellectual suffering. Simply being misunderstood for your beliefs and method of thinking is enough to satisfy this condition. Finally, with spiritual suffering, it seems that this one will lead to suffering automatically. This is because, for those who believe in a higher power, order, or set of ideals, the focus is always metaphysical, to a realm we cannot directly see or perceive. For these religiously or spiritually minded people, suffering is inevitable because perfection lies elsewhere, in a realm that is yet to come and that will more than likely not be experienced in the course of a lifetime. Regardless of how one perceives suffering, the obvious answer is that it is inescapable. Life as we know it cannot be separated from the element of suffering. So where does that leave us exactly? Well, all we can really do is find a way to bear the inevitable suffering and justify it as we see fit. Now that we have rendered the life without any suffering absurd, we will make the case for why someone is better off strengthening themselves in the face of suffering. If an individual wishes to avoid suffering, they might attempt to wrap their body in pillows and never leave the confines of their bedroom. But that is not really living, is it? This is because you would be nothing more than a person waiting for their life to pass them by. No, such a life is far from desirable because it can hardly be classified as life. Life is going out, experiencing the world, and gathering meaning from it. For if we cannot escape the suffering, the least we can do is to make it mean something, to justify our suffering. The most effective use of your time is to work within the confines of reality. Life is a game and suffering is its fundamental rule. The unfortunate truth is that you will have to learn to bear it, and if you don't, then life becomes increasingly arduous. But how does one become stronger? How does one accustom themselves to suffering? Did you not agree that people desire and go out of their way to avoid suffering? Yes, indeed. However, the response to these questions is to assert that one can refrain from putting themselves in situations that cause undue suffering. For example, drinking or smoking excessively are choices that will cause further suffering in the long run. They are choices that a person can make, but it is not in their best interest to do so, especially if they wish to avoid suffering. There are most certainly situations where suffering is inevitable, like getting rejected by a love interest, not getting a dream job, or failing to achieve a goal. If suffering is a natural byproduct of these scenarios, then there also exist alternatives where suffering is optional. Drinking or smoking excessively have already been noted as choices that cause optional suffering. What is meant by optional is that the suffering born out of these choices is dependent, whereas with the former three situations, it errs more on the inevitable side. The point is that, depending on our choices, suffering can be minimized or maximized, just like pleasure can. If one arguably makes better choices, they will have less suffering, whereas if they make poor choices, they will only bring about enhanced suffering. In order to strengthen oneself in the face of suffering, one must accept the first assumption of inevitable hardship. No matter how you live your life, the component of suffering will never evaporate. Now for assumption 2, which is that in spite of the existence of suffering, you can take steps to minimize it, i.e., making positive and productive choices. Finally, the last assumption is that the extent of suffering is primarily due to your reaction or response to it. How you react changes everything. Will you make a mountain out of a molehill, or will you remain calm and collected? The Stoics are major proponents of this third assumption, which largely ties in with the first presupposition, that hardship is inevitable. No matter what situation you find yourself in, ladies and gentlemen, there will be some element of suffering or distress, but the real question is, how will you react? To conclude, the only surefire way to strengthen oneself in the face of suffering is to carry on. Adversity builds character, and the only choice one has, in order to lead an effective life, is to persevere in spite of overwhelming opposition. The alternative is to roll over and give up. But then what? If you quit, then what will you do? What will come next? Nothing good, most certainly, but if you choose to persevere, there is light at the end of the tunnel, even if it seems like it will never come.